Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the controversial story of general officers in the First World War and whether their modern reputation as butchers and bunglers is fairly deserved. Well, hello, Dan, another podcast episode, and this is one where we're going to be tackling what I think might be the most enduring, not necessarily myth, because we're going to assess this myth, most enduring idea, especially in Britain and to an extent the English-speaking world, of the First World War. And this is the fact, or the assumed fact, that because the casualties in the First World War were so high, the generals themselves must have been to blame, and that they were the donkeys who would lead their lions to their destruction. And we're going to be tackling a few, shall we say, very, very stubborn and enduring ideas here. And I suspect we might ruffle a few feathers and perhaps cause a little bit of controversy.
Yeah, I suspect we probably will. Even, 100 plus years later, this is still a hot topic. And I hope that whilst we might be coming up with some ideas, and not necessarily ones that are completely alien to military history, certainly maybe ones that are more alien to a general listener from the public, and I know that isn't really our demographic here on the podcast. We've got a lot of knowledgeable people, but with a little bit of context, maybe we can at least shine a light on the true story and make our own decisions. Each and all of us can make our own decisions on what we really feel, because I think there's still a lot of things open for question here. And let's get into a few with the if I can rather flippantly say, First World War bingo terms, the kind of things that you hear day in and day out working in military history related to the general officer. And I'm going to throw one at you straight away here, Spence, see if you can give us your assessment here. So let's go with the idea that all officers are out of touch.
This is one that is an interesting one because it does actually have a little bit of truth to it. And one of the reasons for this is it's actually twofold. One is that it's assumed, perhaps not incorrectly, that to be a general in the First World War and oversee battles, which would cost tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of your men, you must have had a pretty hard heart. You must be pretty callous and vicious. And I'm reminded actually of a great pen portrait that Winston Churchill wrote about Douglas Haig, the commander of the British Army from 1916 to 1918. And he compared Douglas Haig to a skilled surgeon who was going to use all the methods that they had available to them. But at heart, they'd do their best, and if their patient died, well, they wouldn't shed too many tears. And I think that certainly captures something about Douglas Haig, because when he has to read his personal diary, produced, interestingly enough, as something of a historical record, because at times he can be very bitter about he's not bitter perhaps, but he can be very callous about his soldiers. He sometimes accuses his soldiers of cowardice, when in fact, it's a surfeit of bravery that's got them into trouble. They've suffered very heavy losses rather than failing to leave the trenches. They've left the trenches and simply never come back. And this is a charge that is hung around the necks of quite a large number of generals. And I can understand why, because there is some evidence for it. And there is the assumption, of course, that you have to be callous to command in this, which is true. But of course, it's not the whole truth, is it, Dan? There are generals who actually really do feel the suffering of their men quite keenly.
Yeah, and I would even argue a majority of generals. I mean, I think one of the things that quite often happens when we think about the general officer in the First World War is we view them in isolation as a general officer, somebody who was only ever a general, that they almost materialized from a person on the street to become a general. Of course, the reality is that's not the case at all. They're there predominantly based on merit. Now, this is maybe something that we can argue about as we go through this. But a good general was there because before that he's been a good colonel, and before that he's been a good major, and he's been a promising captain and a promising lieutenant. So he's gone through the ranks. He knows the jobs of those guys underneath him because he himself has done those jobs before. And so with regards to being out of touch, I don't think we can level that one fairly. I don't think we can say generals completely do not understand what anyone around them is doing. They do. These guys rely on the people further down their chain of command in order to provide them with the information that's required and to make sure that they are getting the right material for their job. There's a couple of good things I think that we can touch on here with regards to being particularly being out of touch. One of the things that's quite often leveled is that those men never go into the front lines. General officers don't go in the front lines. Above brigadier, it's pretty rare. Below brigadier or brigadier and below, brigadier being the first of the general officer ranks, it certainly is the norm, and men do regularly go into the front lines, and officers, we'll touch on this a bit later, get killed doing so. And so, they do have their finger on the pulse a little bit, at least a little bit, perhaps more than that. It's such a tricky subject to wind yourself around. The actual idea of saying these generals were old and out of touch, they didn't know what was going on. I think generally speaking, we could largely dispel that one. And not caring, certainly that one as well for me goes out of the window. I think you only need, I think, to exercise common sense in this way to understand that, of course, very few, if any, were callous and uncaring, because these guys know the men under their command. They care about them. They've been brought up, they've been trained, indoctrinated into decades of military service to do exactly that, to care about their men in their charge. That doesn't disappear overnight just because you extend in rank. The idea though of saying, well, these guys are out of touch. I mean, think for a minute. And the British Army is an enormous organisation in 1915, 16, 17, 18. Douglas Haig's in command of, 5.4 million men, something like that, who serve on the Western Front. If you take a modern company, take Apple, for example, and you want to go in and buy an iPhone, it sounds quite flippant, but I hope you bear with me. Go in and buy an iPhone. Has anybody here ever been served by the CEO of Apple on the till? Of course not. He's got guys to do that job for him. In fact, his job is upstairs in the office forming the strategy. Same thing applies for Douglas Haig. It's why you don't see him in a trench. Doesn't mean he doesn't care, but it's simply not his job. And I think from that point of view, Spence, that's one of the really interesting ones. And it can lead into so many different things. Competence to actually be in that job is an interesting one. I mean, what's your take on that?
We're really getting into some deep and interesting territory. And I wanted to pick up on your comment about generals being in the front line. So some generals do go into the front line quite regularly, and some pay for that with their lives or with their limbs. And one general I'd just like to pick out, something of a personal hero of mine, Walter Congreve, VC. He's won the VC, the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for bravery in the Boer War. He's an incredibly tough character, an Iron Man. He's suffering from very severe asthma all his life. He thinks it's almost a moral failing, and he can overcome it through sheer force of will. His nickname in the army is Old Concrete, even though he's not particularly old. It gives you some idea about how tough this guy is. And he loves being in the frontline trenches. He really feels an affinity for his men. And about callousness and not caring and not being connected to the men, he's commanding 6th Division. In 1915, he actually does extremely well as a divisional commander, and he gets promoted to command 13th Corps. And when he leaves, the division lines the road, battalions line the road, and they cheer him and they wave their hats and they give him a send-off. And this tough man, this Iron Man of the army, and he really is an Iron Man, he actually weeps as he leaves. He's so emotionally overwhelmed because he's divisional soldiers, and division's about 18,500 men, of whom about 12,000 are infantry. That's the celebration they give him. That's how much he's loved. But at the same time, although he feels this affection for his men, he's also a really tough character. He bears down on incompetence and ill discipline. Some of the things he writes in his diary might raise eyebrows now. So his corps does very well at the Battle of Somme. Probably the most successful of the British corps at the start of the battle. And in his personal diary, he goes back to the aid station on the 1st and 2nd of July, and he's actually speaking to the men to raise their morale. But he writes in his diary, there's far too many men of the shopkeeper class. So these are Kitchener volunteers, not the full-scale professionals of 1914. And they're all back in the hospitals, and they've all got really minor wounds. And I was really annoyed with them, and I turfed some of them out, and I sent them back to their units. Now, taken out of context, we might go, well, that's what a callous man. He's kicking these wounded and traumatized men back to the front line. But that's the balance in a war that's being fought for national survival, where the stakes are enormous, where millions of men are fighting. You have to be tough as well. And that doesn't mean you're callous. There's a difference between toughness and callousness, I think. But actions that, to perhaps 21st century eyes, we have a different view of mental health and modern and soldiers' health, for that matter, as well, might seem a bit cruel and a bit harsh. 1914, 15, 16, these are acceptable. And I think Congreve's a great example of, he's loved by his men, but he's also a real tough taskmaster. He's hard but fair. And I think a lot of the best commanding officers have that in them. And just to finish this about going into the front line, so Congreve loves to go in the front line. It actually drives his assistants, his ADCs, insane, because he likes to go into the front line, speak to people, speak to soldiers, tour around. Well, eventually that activity gets him into trouble, because in 1917, he's caught in a German artillery bombardment, and it basically blows off part of his left arm, and he has to have his left arm replaced. He actually has it replaced with a hook rather than a prosthetic hand, but it takes him out of action for months, and he never really recovers from that wound. And that's one of the reasons why having your best generals, your most experienced commanders down in the front line is not really the best position for them to be, is it, Dan?
That's very true. And just to set my own reminder for us to come back to that, actually, the name Congreve is really interesting, suggests some relation to the famous Congreve rocket, which predates it. Maybe we'll come back to that, because I think one of the other things that's sometimes leveled is people getting into their position based on family ties and being part of the old aristocracy. And maybe that's something we can come back to. But in the meantime, I just want to touch on one of my favorite poems of the First World War. I have to say, I'm not a big war poem guy, but I really like this one. And it relates to generals and senior officers being in the trenches, in particular the commander, the recently brought in commander of the 63rd Royal Naval Division. So this is a Royal Navy division made up of sailors who basically are surplus, because there's more sailors than there are ships available at that time. So the Royal Navy puts a land fighting division in during the Battle of the Somme. And actually, they're pretty elite by the time they reach the end of the war. The Germans rate them as one of the highest performing divisions, the entire BEF. But the man that they bring in to command this division is Major General Cameron Shute. Cameron Shute is not a particularly popular officer. He's a stickler for things like keeping clean, and keeping clean in trenches are not the easiest thing in the world to do. There's some logic behind it, actually, in terms of keeping down illness and various things like that. But he falls out of favour with his men of the Royal Naval Division fairly quickly, one of whom is one of the most celebrated and fascinating characters of the first half of the 20th century, a man by the name of A.P. Herbert, who is from the kind of London jet set of the time, if you like. Well, I'll give you an example. In the Second World War, his contribution is to use his pleasure yacht as a Royal Navy detachment, as a Royal Navy section. He even gets a section created. I think it's called the Thames Boat Defence Squadron or something like that. In effect, it's his yacht. So him and his friends, the rest of his crew, are put down as, the president of the British Museum and various others. It's his rich mates. They decide that their contribution during the Second World War, Spence, is to get a couple of Lewis guns, sit on A.P. Herbert's yacht, and shoot at German bombers as they come up the Thames during the Blitz whilst drinking champagne. So this is the kind of character this man is. Anyway, I digress. So he's in the division in 1916, and he writes this poem, which is one of my favourites, about Cameron Shute. The general inspecting the trenches exclaimed with a horrified shout, "I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about." But nobody took any notice. No one was prepared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared to the presence of Shute. And certain responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing that his staff advisers consisted entirely of turds. For shit may be shot at odd corners, and papers supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if someone shot that shit Shute. Which I love. Not exactly the most popular character. Interesting. He's one of those guys who I think goes in perhaps with something of the stickler mentality that I think taste maybe more of the late Victorian era, Spencer. And is this responsible, in a sense, for some of the divide between the working class lads of 1914-16 to the Victorian gentlemen and the clash that occurs on the Western Front?
It is. And this is something I think that's, again, easy to forget, that right through the Victorian era, the army had occupied this strange place in British society that, particularly from the 1880s onwards, the army had become very popular culturally. So people like to buy books about the army. They like to read about the army. They like pictures of soldiers. They like the pageantry of the army. But that didn't mean they actually liked to join the army. And I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but as late as 1914, a way of saying between a rock and a hard place or the devil in the deep blue sea was to say it's the army or the workhouse in Britain, because it was felt you only joined the army if you were truly thick and desperate or you were running away from something. And the British Army, although publicly popular, it never translates into recruitment. And so it recruited a certain type of man as a common soldier, many of whom were very rough, tough, and in some cases pretty desperate. And the officers who would rise to high command, that's the army they knew, of these rough, tough individuals who would put up with strict discipline and undoubtedly were some really tough guys. These are the guys who'd fight at Mons and so on. But then you've got a different army. The volunteer army means it's recruited from all corners of British society, and that's never happened before. So you get men, as Congreve said, of the shopkeeper class. You get men like A.P. Herbert, who are coming from the jet set. You get poets. You get people with literary skills. But you also get miners, dock workers, foresters, all kinds of jobs as well. But crucially, these are people who are coming with a very different expectation of life. They're not quite so willing to accept army discipline unquestioningly. And for an officer class that's never encountered this type of soldier before, there is a bit of a clash of cultures here that, you know, you've got to do this kind of thing. You've got to do what we say. Oh, these people don't listen. They're not like our old soldiers. There's an awful lot of all our yesterdays, especially in 1916, from some of the general officers. But it's one of those things that ultimately the army does gradually adapt to and does gradually change to. But it's really important to remember that cultural difference between the army of 1914 and before then, for decades before, and the army of 15 and 16. And to a general officer, seeing what he, in his view, would probably be quite soft soldiers. They're not keeping the trenches clean. They may, I doubt they'd be answering back, but they may be giving him a bit of a side eye. They might be a bit surly. This would be absolutely intolerable. And so it's a clash of cultures, but that does change as the war goes on. The soldiers become hardened. And also, I think the generals become more understanding of the type of man they're commanding.
Yeah, all really interesting points, actually. And, when it comes to the generals, and just thinking back to some of the comments that I've heard previously regarding generals, and going back to the Congreve idea here. Congreve, for those of us with an interest in military history, is certainly a name that we would have heard associated from way back in Napoleonic times. What sort of numbers are we talking, Spencer, of officers that have come from that kind of background? Are you family? It's a family occupation to go and join the army, and is there a difference in those officers, particularly those senior officers, compared with those who have maybe brought themselves up a little more by their bootstraps?
Well, at the start of the war, and indeed for much of the war, the army's more senior command, so major generals, men who are commanding divisions of about 18,500 men and above, are pretty homogenous. So these are nearly all regular soldiers who've come into the army. A lot of them have come because of family connections. So Congreve, for example, traces his military lineage way back to the 1600s. There's been Congreves in the military for centuries. And so he's got a really deep pedigree, as have certain other commanders who are part of this. Others are drawn from a pretty narrow social range. So they are essentially aristocratic, and they've slowly but surely risen through the ranks. But what is notable about these is that, particularly in 1916, 17, that there's a bit of a changeover in officers, because there just aren't enough officers to actually fill all the roles required. And 1916 is a pretty brutal year to be a British general officer. A lot get replaced, a lot get sacked. And gradually, I think the army changes from these traditional aristocratic figures, perhaps not at divisional and corps level, but certainly at battalion and brigade level. You start to see fewer of these men, and you start to see guys who've come from very unusual backgrounds, either industrial backgrounds, they've come up through the ranks, or even one of my absolute favourite characters in terms of just what a life to lead, Dennis Reitz, who is a Boer. He's a Boer who fought against the British in the Boer War and wrote a terrific book about it called Commando. He ends up joining the British Army in the First World War. He's commanding a battalion in 1918. I think it's a Scots battalion from memory. So what an unusual character. Where's he come from? And you see a few of these characters who come through. So the nature of the army changes. And I would argue that's because, although it doesn't get there initially, it takes some time, the army is certainly aspiring to be a meritocracy. It wants to try and promote the best men. It wants to try and reward competence. Now, it doesn't always get it right. Sometimes people get over-promoted. Sometimes people are in the wrong position. But by 1918, I think it's getting a lot more right than it's getting wrong.
And that's a really interesting point. And maybe we should just get a real brief understanding of this. I mean, I don't think, I certainly don't feel this way, and I'd imagine you don't as well. You know, if we took every general officer in the British Army in 1914 or perhaps early 1915, are there some bad eggs in there? People who are simply not up to the job? I would say definitely yes. I don't know. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
There's always going to be some bad eggs. There's always going to be some people who just, no matter any organization of sufficient size will have some people who are of lesser ability than others. Mm-hmm. And although the army does its best to try and root these people out, inevitably some of them remain in position. And there's also people, of course, who are perhaps competent to a level, and then they find themselves promoted beyond that level, and they cannot cope with it. So there's some tragic cases where you might be a very good battalion commander, and then you get promoted to brigade. That's 4 times the size of a battalion. Battalion's about 1,000 men, brigade about 4,000 men. Can't do it. The jump's too much. Same with brigadiers going into divisional command and above and beyond. And just on that, a character who, if we're turning the tide a little bit and saying, well, a man who is basically lacking competence in many respects, is Alma Hunter Weston, somewhat mockingly known as Hunter Bunter. Now, Alma Hunter Weston is one of the elite brigadiers of 1914. He commands his brigade with great skill and daring. He forces a bridgehead across the River Ain in 1914 in a really terrific infantry operation, and he gets promoted to be a divisional commander, commands 29th Regular Division. This guy seems to be the absolute flying star. He's the type of person you want to promote. He's brilliant as a brigadier. Shall we say his career as a divisional commander and then a corps commander is not exactly covered in glory, Dan?
No, indeed. I mean, we can come back to, of course, we are predominantly focusing Western Front here, but I'm sure we'll come back to various other theatres at some point. I'm going to leave Hunter Weston to you, Spence, because I know you know his story better than I do. But in terms of officers who are capable compared to those who are not, it's interesting that you mentioned over promotion here. I mean, you could argue some very famous characters throughout history are over promoted. Rommel would be a good example in the German army in the Second World War. Perhaps gets over promoted and isn't so competent as a field marshal as he was as a divisional or corps commander. But one of the things, just sort of sidetracking slightly, that I find really interesting, we're talking about the idea of a meritocracy. One of the statistics that really sticks in my mind that maybe is an example of that is the average age of officers and how that switches between 1914 to 1918. Because the average age goes down from something like 58 in 1914 to 48. So for a major general or higher. That to me is an example, not necessarily of the rigours of campaigning, although I expect there is some kind of influence in that, but rather the weeding out of perhaps older, more out of touch generals in favour of those who can be a little more dynamic on the battlefield. And I wonder if Hunter Weston falls into the good at what he did, but not so good when it comes to dynamism on the battlefield.
I think he does, and he's a strange man as well. He's a deeply strange man. He does strange things. He has strange outlooks on life. His personal papers are quite fascinating, but also incredibly frustrating because he keeps a diary and he'll write in it, met Douglas Haig and we planned the attack in great detail. And that will be all he says. And then he'll write about 3 pages about what he had for lunch and what wines went with it. And as a historian, it makes you want to pull your hair out. You think, oh, come on, tell us some details. But he's clearly got some problems of competence. He commands the 29th Division at Gallipoli. Very, very difficult campaign, very brutal campaign. I'm sure we'll cover in the future. He doesn't command that with any great distinction, although he does seem to start to learn something, start to learn a few methods. Then he comes out and he commands on the Somme, and he's a bit of a disaster on the Somme. It really has to be said. He does not do well there, and he sort of seems to have reached the limit of his intellectual ability. He doesn't get any better, but he's well connected. He stays in post, and he does not cover himself in glory. And I have to share this anecdote because it's one of my favourite strange anecdotes about a British general. He actually dies, he lives through the war. He dies later after the war. He dies in odd circumstances because he's got, as I say, it's a man of strange habits. One of his habits is in the morning, he gets up and he climbs out of his bedroom window. He lives in a stately home that's a mock castle. He climbs out of his bedroom window and he goes on his balcony outside and he does gymnastics to keep himself fit first thing in the morning. And one wintry day, I think it's 1940, so it's years after the war, he climbs out of his bedroom window to do his gymnastics. It's a bit cold and slippy outside. He slips on the balcony and he falls off the roof and dies. And a strange death for a strange man. But the fact that he's in post like this, actually, I think it speaks a little bit about the way that the army probably overfavours generals who've done really well in 1914. These are the old guard. These are the old veterans. And if you look at the number of commanders who survive 1914, who go on to do other things, nearly everybody who survives gets promoted as a result of this. But by 1917-18, unless you're really competent, I do agree that you've basically been weeded out. You have to really show your ability to fight on. And your comment about age is really important because it's reflected across the entire BEF. The average age of officers falls at every single level. And these new men, they're younger, they're maybe physically fitter, perhaps it's quicker, it's easier for them to learn. It's said it gets harder for you to learn as you get older. You're set in your ways. These young officers are not. And in fact, one of the big conclusions the British Army draws from the war is we need younger officers overall, which will have effects in the Second World War. But it's interesting about how the expectations of what an officer does or does not do change during the war. And I'd like to sort of bring that on to something that is an enduring myth, and it's on our bingo card. And this is chateau generalship. The idea that the generals just sit in their chateau and they make their decisions and they send tens of thousands of men to their deaths and they don't really notice them. Encapsulated, I think, by the British TV series Blackadder Goes Forth, where there's a scene where Douglas Haig has got a lot of toy soldiers on his desk on a map, and he just sweeps them into a dustpan and throws them all away and then goes back to his desk. And that idea that these generals didn't know what it was like in the front line, didn't care, it's a really tough one to shake, I think, Dan.
It is, but the thing about it, Spence, is as you were describing Chateau Generals, the immediate image I had is of Haig with the dustpan, shoveling his toy soldiers off the desk. And it's catchy. It's a great series. It's very interesting. It sticks. It should not be used as a yardstick for our understanding of military history, particularly the First World War. But the Chateau Generals myth, and I do think this one is it is and it isn't. Do generals spend a lot of time in chateaus? Yes, they do. Is there a good military reason for it? Yes, there is. So I think that's the reality here. And if we just boil it down slightly and have a look at the practical situation, taking an example, for example, a stretch of the line, it could be any particular place. It doesn't matter too much. If we take, though, a major general who's in command, as we said, about 12,000 men bayonet strength in the British Army, but it applies broadly to other units and other armies as well. He's, in theory, commanding a stretch of about 10,000 yards worth of line. So he's got a frontage of maybe 10,000 yards when his troops are in the front line. They, of course, are made up of around 12 battalions, of which maybe 9 or 10 are in the front line at the same time. And they're side by side in the line. Behind them are their brigadier generals who command groups of 4 brigades of 4 battalions each at any given time. And then you've got the major general and his staff sitting on top of that. Now, one of the problems you've got is just a geographic one. So if you're in a 10,000 yard frontage, you need to be as aware what's happening on your left with your left-hand battalion as you do with your right-hand battalion. In order to do that, you need to situate yourself and your staff and your communication structure and all of these kind of things in a convenient place where you can be found easily, where you can house your detailed communications set up, where you can have messages go back and forth, where you can equally get to the left or the right-hand side of your division. And in order to do that, you're best off a couple of miles behind the line and right in the center of your position. Now, if you want to go a little bit further, you should be saying, okay, well, let's get somewhere with already a decent communications infrastructure, maybe landlines and this kind of thing in place. Well, guess what? chateaus are ideal for that. So from that point of view, having somewhere that you can house your staff, having somewhere centrally located, easy to find, right behind your own lines, where you can keep an eye on the left and the right hand side of your line, that's ideal. Chateaus are ideal, and they're there. And let's be honest, if I had a chance of living in a chateau or a little coal miner's bungalow somewhere, I'm going for the chateau as well. It's not unreasonable from that point of view. But to use the chateau as a stick to beat generals with, to say that they're not caring of their men, I think is maybe an oversimplification. Let's be clear, private soldiers in the front lines do have a very tough, very grim job, as do junior officers. And as possibly with that of general, when he was a lieutenant 15 years before, 20 years before, it's not like they've not done their stint in those positions. But in order to be anywhere near effective at their job, and this comes back to the kind of the Apple CEO of Apple serving you as you buy your iPhone kind of thing, there are other people in a better position to do that job, and they're dispersed around in the most convenient locations for them. And the Major General's best spot to be is behind the lines in a central location. In fact, I'd argue, Spence, that there's an element, although it does happen, there's an element of irresponsibility for generals to spend excessive amounts of time in front lines where they're likely to get themselves killed. Because quite simply, if you get killed as a Major General in command of a division, you unleash havoc on the infrastructure of your own division.
You really do. And this is something that I think it can be a source of frustration because life in a chateau is pretty good. Yeah, as you rightly say, I'd rather be in a chateau than in a dugout down in the trenches. But it also makes absolute sense for a Major General to be there, or indeed a higher ranking general to be there. You have access to all the communications you have. On a 10,000 yard frontage, unless you're in an aircraft, you cannot see the entire frontage. Where better to be than at the hub of a communications network that's going to communicate with you, and that you can get all the information, you can react to it in a much better way, you can send your orders out. In fact, reading through various battles of the First World War, one of the biggest problems, and this happens more so in 1915, it also happens in 1918, is when divisional commanders or even corps commanders get overexcited and they go rushing right up to the front line or near to the front line, and messages are pouring back into their headquarters that need a response, but the general's not there. He's in his staff car racing around, and we might see that as a form of heroic leadership, and he's taking charge, it's filling the vision of a leader, but that's not really what a general is there to do. The general is there to direct and manage, and in the context of 1914, where you don't have portable radios, you can't do a Rommel and drive around in an armoured car with a radio and command the battle from there. That just doesn't exist. You have to command it from your telephone exchange. Where's the best place to have that? In a nice, secure building. And hey, if it's comfortable and there's a drinks cabinet, well, that's a bonus. But the main point is actually having that ability to control the battle, such as you can only be done from that place.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know whether our conversation today is going to once and for all put to bed the myth of Chateau Generals. I've got a sneaking suspicion it's not going to, but it may be a little chip out of that particular element. I mean, but these things all tie in. There are a number of things I think that come from this idea of chateaus and never being in the front line. I just want to touch on casualties briefly, because one of the things that I think we often hear is, generals send their men to die whilst they're safe in their chateaus. Safe in their chateau is one thing, but safe in the front line is very different, or safe from shell fire is very different. As we've discussed already in this series, the Great War really is a gunner's war. It's you're more likely to be killed by an artillery shell than anything else, quite significantly for that matter. Although if you were to be in the front line, you become a very high value target if you're a senior officer. And so there are actually surprisingly heavy casualties to senior officers. It's something, brigadier and upwards is something in the 20% casualty rate throughout the Great War on the Western Front, which is not dissimilar to that of a private soldier.
No, it's not. And if you consider this is going to sound a little bit grim, but in terms of military efficiency, the army has millions of private soldiers, but it only has hundreds of brigadiers. And so every brigadier that's lost is difficult to replace. You're losing all that experience. And if you lose the brigadier in the midst of a battle, then essentially your chain of command's broken, with severe consequences that could even lead to battlefield defeat. And the casualties amongst the more senior generals are significant. I think it's over 100 generals are killed or wounded in the Great War from the British side. So it's by no means comfortable or cushy or easy living as a general. And this emphasizes the point about the dangers of going too close to the front line. There are multiple. In fact, I mentioned Congreve loses his left arm. Essentially, it was left hand. A figure who appeared on this podcast in an earlier episode, Tom Bridges, who rallied the broken battalions in 1914 at Saint-Quentin, with an act of heroism. Well, he goes on to be a divisional commander, and he gets his leg blown off. He always has his leg mutilated when he's commanding, I think, 19th Division. Memorably, he has it amputated in the surgery. He's asked, what do you want to do with this leg? Have it buried in your family plot? And he says, no, feed it to the lions in Paris Zoo, which captures something of this. But he never actually commands a division again because his leg injury is so severe. You've lost a very experienced officer because he's too close to the front line and he's been blown up. And this is why it's better to command from these safer places, because then you can control the battle and you're much less likely to be killed, because ultimately you do not want your senior officers to be killed and wounded during the midst of an intense battle.
Yeah, and I think in a sense as well, and you make a really good point there, not only do senior officers represent, of course, years of knowledge, but also they're an investment in a way. They're 20 years, 15 years worth of army investment into shaping them into a senior general. I forget who it is. I think it's a French commander that says it costs something like 20 or 40,000 lives to create a general. What they mean by that, and this goes back to that tragic idea of the Great War as a poker game. The generals putting their chips down and trying their hand against the opposing general's hand. Of course, those chips are lives. And those lessons that we've spoken about throughout this series, they are learned, but they're learned at the lives of men. And, so that's why I think part of the reason why when we look at generals, we kind of have this dismay, because so many of us, myself included, and I think yourself as well, Spencer, have personal connections and individuals who are lost in the Great War. Maybe we'll come back to that at the end of this episode. But at the same time, there is definitely movement amongst the rigidity of the pre-war military structure, and we can see that in senior officers in the First World War. And one of my favourites has got to come in the shape of this man here, Roland Boys Bradford. He is a brigadier general in 1917, holding the Victoria Cross, no less. A very, very impressive officer, has done some remarkable things, and has already shown great courage in the front line, personal courage, also care for his men, and has been rewarded for it. The amazing thing about Roland Boyce Bradford, he's 25. He's killed age 25, and would certainly have been promoted to Major General had he lived long enough. Sadly, he didn't. Perhaps spending a little too much time in the front line. But this is a man who led from the front. And then there's I think a general point to make here, Spencer. Perhaps further down the officer chain, which is quite often level, but maybe we can address it here. The idea of sending men over the top to their deaths. Yes, senior officers, I think by rights, are sending men over the top in that sense, and not going over leading them themselves. But field grade officers, so majors, company officers, captains, lieutenants, they're sending men over, but they're going over at the head of their men. It's not go on boys, off you go. It's come on boys, follow me. Which is a subtle but very powerful difference.
It is. And that's the one thing I don't think anybody can seriously level at the British officer class, that they lacked courage, and particularly slightly lower down, brigadiers in the front line, certainly battalion COs in the front line. We talked about this in previous episodes. This does lead to heavy casualties amongst officers. And one thing that I find a little bit discomforting in some ways, and as entertaining as things like Oh, What a Lovely War are, and Blackadder is, the character in Blackadder goes forth of George, who's the stereotypical idiot aristocratic public schoolboy officer who's completely naive to the horrors of war and thinks it's all an adventure. Although men may have volunteered because they wanted an adventure, they wanted to experience something new, I think the courage, the determination to go over the top with a lead from the front is absolutely shot through the British Army right the way from 1914 right up until 1918. And if there's one thing that really strikes me about the officers of 1918, when we read about them, you've got men who are 22, 23, 24. They had volunteered a few years earlier. Now they're lieutenants, captains, and majors. Quite often they've got gallantry awards, and they're leading the conscripts who are 18 and 19 into battle. And this is a very, very young army. And in fact, if you look at photos of the army from 1918, you can see the youth of the soldiers in their faces. And for these men who've come often from a completely non-military background to have risen to command battalions or even brigades is testament to that meritocracy, and it's testament to their courage. And if there's one thing that I think I find a little bit discomforting, it's the assumption that that courage was based on ignorance and naivety. Maybe when they volunteered, but it would only take one battle to disabuse you of that notion. And yet these men continue to show the highest standards of courage and didn't flinch. And many of them, of course, paid for that courage with their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And those that don't, quite often by 1918, have risen themselves to a more prominent place where actually they can increase the efficiency of the army. Two characters I think we must mention for our friends from different parts of the empire, the Commonwealth as it must be, regularly brought forward as being significant contributors and perhaps more so than others are going to be our friends Sir John Monash of the Australians and General Currie with the Canadians. Both of those I think are, I don't know, what's your take on them, Spencer? Perhaps there's maybe a little bit of, without wanting to upset any of our friends from those nationalities, perhaps not quite as straightforward as they're seen as. They are certainly seen as national heroes and both perform well, but there needs a little bit of context here.
There does, and this is I'd love to revisit this, and particularly look at Canadians and Australians in separate episodes. But what's interesting, particularly about Monash and Currie, is of course they are outside the traditional, what I might call the social officer class. They appear to be outsiders. They do not have the traditional routes through promotion that the British Army has had up until this point. And so they're outsiders. That may give them a different view on war, particularly Monash. He's not perhaps so hidebound by the traditions and the nature of the thinking that the British Army has had. And this has led some people to say this made Monash absolutely brilliant because he was so innovative and he was thinking differently and so on. Well, my argument is Monash is the type of person who would have done well in any army at almost any time because he clearly has ability, and indeed so does Currie. What they have that's an advantage, I think, over the wider British Army is that they're within their own national contingents, and those national contingents function a bit like proto-national armies. It's a bit like, although it's part of the British Army, the Canadians and the Anzacs are a little bit like Canada and Australia/New Zealand's army. They operate slightly differently. They have slightly different regulations, and they stay as a whole. And what's interesting about Currie in particular is he makes mistakes. His conduct at the first big battle the Canadians fight, Second Ypres in 1915, well, it's not actually that perfect. He makes some mistakes, but crucially he gets to learn from them. Because if there's one mistake I think that the wider British Army makes, particularly in 15 and 16, is it's very, very hard on mistakes. It's perhaps too hard on mistakes. And if you sack a general the moment he makes a mistake, then that general's never going to learn. And it's inconsistently applied as well. So you have generals who make mistakes, or sometimes honest mistakes, can't be helped. I'm thinking of Stuart Wortley, who is a highly intelligent man. He commands 46th North Midland Division. He gets given two impossible tasks: attack Hohenzollern Redoubt in 1915 and then attack Gommecourt in 1916. Nobody could do anything with those orders. And he gets sacked, he gets blamed for it. Whereas other men like Hunter Weston, who've alluded to, he makes mistake after mistake after mistake and just doesn't really get punished for it. So I think the British Army is a bit harsh with punishment and is a bit inconsistent with it. Whereas in the Canadians and the Anzacs, there's more time to learn. And I think that is an important feature for both Currie and Monash. You can see them improving and grasping battle and moving from there. Now, whether, particularly with Monash, the fact that he came from such a non-military background plays a role in that, perhaps it opens much more imaginative thinking, possibly. But my view is that in a prolonged war such as this of intense fighting, it does give opportunity for the best, ultimately, provided they can avoid becoming casualties, to rise to the top. And I think Monash fits that bill. Do I think he's the greatest general in the First World War? No, I think we can get a bit overexcited by that and view him as something completely different. And there's all kinds of talk, he should have been commander of the entire BF. And there's good reasons he isn't commander of the entire BF. But he does show that, in a way, he's the embodiment of meritocracy. Somebody from a non-standard background, him and Curry, rising to the top and proving that they belong there.
Yes, very interesting. And of course, there is some people posit the idea that, yes, Monash should have ended up as the commander of the entire BEF. I think that's several bridges too far. We'll perhaps come back to that on a different day. But in terms of the actual commander of the BEF, at least the two of them that we popularly talk about, Sir John French being the first, perhaps another story for another day, also quite a complex character, and then Sir Douglas Haig. I'm going to go out on a limb, Spence, and say there are going to be people listening to this right now who say, yeah, it's all well and good what you're talking about with generals, but I still know Douglas Haig. He's still the butcher of the Somme. He still sent people over the top day after day, doing the same thing, didn't care about his men's lives. Convince me otherwise. I can imagine there's somebody listening in right now thinking exactly that. So there we are, Spencer. I'm going to hand it over to you. Convince us otherwise.
Now, I've got complex views about Douglas Haig because for those listeners who might not be aware, there is still a vigorous debate in academic military history about was Haig incompetent and out of his depth, or was he in fact a great captain who commanded the British Army to its greatest victory? The Haig undoubtedly had flaws, and I go back to that comment I made, that great pen portrait Winston Churchill wrote of Haig, which portrayed him as a very determined, very modern thinking, but also quite cold surgeon operating on the patient. And he certainly had that element about him. There's also this element I've mentioned in previous podcasts, and that's that Haig was an optimist. Too much of an optimist, a compound optimist who doubled the good things in his mind until he became absolutely convinced he was on the cusp of a great victory. I don't think Haig had the ability that Napoleon supposedly had of being able to hold his hand over a map and just instinctively read the way the battle was going to go. And this meant that Haig was frequently guilty of pushing too hard with too little, asking too much, and he definitely made mistakes. The Somme and at Passchendaele clearly made some serious errors of judgment here. But ultimately, he does learn. And one thing I would add to this is he ultimately commands the British Army in the 100 Days, which is probably the British Army's greatest series of military victories in its history. And I'm going to use a football manager analogy here, because I know football as an analogy it crops up a lot on this podcast. It's a bit like he's taken over a promising but underachieving team at the end of 1915, and he's led it through some difficult seasons. He's made mistakes, but by about his third season, he's got a really good team. And we cannot, as tempting as it is, we can't say that happened completely divorced from his influence. He oversees the army, promotes technology, in some cases, he promotes the wrong people, he picks the wrong team, but he has shaped and molded this army for several years. And it's a bloody difficult process where he makes mistakes. But it is very much the army that Haig has built. We can't separate the two. Either the army evolves with Douglas Haig, or it doesn't, and you have no influence, which is just completely inaccurate. So is he a great commander? I struggle to go that far, because if he is a great commander, he has a very steep learning curve. But it's impossible not to give him the credit for commanding the army through the 100 Days too. And it's easy to say, well, the army was very good by that stage, to which I'd say, yes, but it was very good because Haig had molded it into that army too. So there is this contrast here. And I find him in some ways a frustrating figure, a maddening figure, because he's obviously got a lot of ability, but he also makes some pretty serious mistakes. And I know that some of my friends and colleagues in academia disagree with this. They actually think he was very highly competent. I won't hear of this sort of criticism, but I'm going to go back to my standard fallback position. It's complicated. But what do you make of Douglas Haig, Dan?
Well, it's really interesting. I don't think I'm too far off your own way of thinking. I wonder if the image that we've got of him is very much within the public at least, a way to try and justify the loss. And I think it doesn't necessarily relate to him as an individual or his performance on the battlefield or behind the battlefield. But in many cases, just looking a cursory look without actually going into the detail of the casualty numbers in the Great War and the losses on individual days when numbers are very high, and then knowing the name of the commander responsible for overseeing those battles, I think immediately you're given a kind of way of looking at this and thinking, well, this guy can't be any good. Who on earth could oversee an army that loses 20,000 guys killed in a single day? And it's a pretty fair point, to be honest, and particularly when your relative is one of those 19,000. I've got a relative who's killed under Haig's command. We've got two, in fact. Do I think that there's a specific relation to that? No, they're worlds apart. Yes, they wear the same uniform, fight during the same general period of time, but Haig's fighting his war behind a desk. He's not telling my grandfather which side of that road to advance across or which tree to go and pass on the left flank. These kind of things, that there's so many moving parts in between A and Z that I don't necessarily feel that Haig is responsible for the kind of catastrophes that we do see on the Western Front. And as you rightly point out, Spence, if we give him the blame for the Somme, we've got to give him the credit for Amiens. And this is something that we don't do.
I think that is the absolute kicker for this. You can't have one without the other. And it's interesting to me that in general popular memory of the First World War, Amiens and the 100 Days campaign that ultimately ends the First World War has left so little impression on the popular memory. Instead, it fixates on the Somme and on Passchendaele and the horrors of those battles, and that the idea this was a victory is ultimately ended in Allied victory is largely forgotten, and that makes condemning Haig all the easier, because suddenly you remove his final act, which is to lead an army to victory. And there's another point here, and this is that in a war of nations, and the First World War is a war of nations, it's a total war, perhaps the first total war in human history to that star, there's always going to be massive casualties because the stakes are enormous. The stakes are national survival. The density of troops is huge. The fighting is incredibly bloody and destructive and relentless. And it's interesting that the British popular mind tars Haig as an unprecedented, unlikely butcher, which you look at all the generals of the First World War, in all the battles they fight, whatever happens, there's going to be heavy casualties. And if you look at the battles of the Second World War, the battles there are very, very bloody and vicious and prolonged and costly. The daily casualty rate during the Battle for Normandy between June, July and August, for the British, that daily casualty rate is higher than the daily casualty rate of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But we don't think of the Battle of Normandy as exceptionally vicious or pointless or attritional. We don't accuse Bernard Montgomery, Monty, of being callous with his men's lives and things like this. And it's interesting about how the public therefore perceives certain battles and certain wars and certain commanders, but doesn't apply those standards to others. And perhaps that's a deeper talk for a completely different podcast, but perhaps it's to do with the fact that Normandy ends with obviously a clear and decisive battlefield victory with positive lasting consequences for the Allies, whereas the Somme, it's not so clear-cut, it's not so obvious. But for whatever reason, we have in Britain, culturally, there's a very selective memory about casualties suffered in the world wars. That means that the casualties in World War II, and they're heavies as well. Well, they're noble, they're worthy, they're worth a sacrifice. Whereas in the First World War, well, it's wasteful, it's futile. And I think that's very interesting. And again, perhaps a topic we can return to at some future point.
Yeah, no doubt. And we're going to have to come back to Haig for sure. I think one of the... And this may be a little skewed with the fact that both of us are Brits here, but it seems to me, to a certain extent, that British generals particularly come in for this hammering during the when talking about senior officers in the First World War, more so than perhaps the Germans do, perhaps American and French generals as well. So it's very interesting. But of course, these same issues, they're plagued really across all major belligerent nations.
They are. There's a French general called Charles Mangin, and he becomes very successful in the 100 Days, but he's probably the only general in the First World War who has the unfortunate nickname Butcher attached to him, and he's pretty brutal and relentless. He's a human battering ram as far as a generalship is concerned, and he sums it up in a very pithy, and I'm sure it sounds better in French than English. He sums it up in a pithy line. He says, "No matter what you do in this war, you lose a lot of men." And that's true. You're assaulting these fixed positions, heavily fortified positions. Modern weaponry is scourging the area. For much of the war, there isn't the technology to break them down. And you look across all the generals. All of them are trying their best to win this war. They're doing what they can. But the nature of the war means it's extremely bloody. And as I say, if we look at the Second World War is extremely bloody. If you were to play around on social media and say, name a great general of the Second World War, somebody's going to say Marshal Zhukov of the Russians. If you look at the casualties Zhukov's armies suffered between 41 and 45, it's in the millions and millions and millions. The Soviet Union is profligate with its manpower. But we don't tend to think about it in the same way. And I find that very interesting that the generals of the First World War are uniquely tarred with this butcher label. Whereas if we go in opposite directions, we've dealt with the Second World War, that's extremely bloody. Even if we went back to the last really, really, really big European war, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars are fabulously bloody. Battles are incredibly costly, and of course with a much lower population in Europe. Napoleon responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens, and yet in France is still a national hero. And so I think that for whatever reason, perhaps it's because the First World War doesn't produce these clear-cut victories. It is a grinding attritional conflict. There aren't rapid advances except at the beginning and the end of the war. It seems so costly, so much fighting for such a small area of territory. We don't think of it in the same way. But whenever there is a major war between roughly equal powers, it will always be bloody. And why we tar the First World War generals as being uniquely bad in this regard, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's a mindset that will be useful to us if we're going to be completely analytical about it to abandon and think about it in a wider context instead.
Absolutely, really interesting. And I suppose the final element to mention there is the idea of tactics being the same and wasteful and going over the top and repeatedly doing the same thing time after time. Well, I'd like to come back to that actually, Spence, in a final episode or in a future episode. As much as I think it would be fascinating to come back to various other elements we discussed today. I don't know that we've solved the question about what generals are like in the First World War. I do hope we've provided some context about them, though, and hopefully some food for further thought. So do please send us in your questions, comments, considerations. We'd love to discuss them on the podcast in the future. But for the time being, that brings us to the end of today's podcast episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. And big thank you to Spencer, as always, and for you guys coming along to join us. And we will see you again soon. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
And assess whether their modern reputation as butchers.
That can go in the outtakes.
Yeah, butchers. Oh my gosh.